Hi everyone, and welcome to what I hope will be a continuing video series here as we get going in Western civilization. So what I hope to do today is to summarize some of the main points and key takeaways from Greece, Rome, and our transition into the Middle Ages. So hopefully I can try to make sense for some of the things you guys have been reading about and see if we can't make some light of all this. So we're going to start with Greece. And just like everything in this course, I'm going to try to quickly summarize Greece, which is not an easy task, but I want to try to see if I can hit some of the key points here for you guys. So why start our exploration of Western civilization here? Some of you may be wondering why we aren't starting with Egypt or even earlier, the Sumerians. And to answer this, it helps to know exactly what Western civilization is, which will help explain why we're starting with Greece. So, Western civilization is really formed from three pillars or three main traditions. One is the classical culture of Greece and Rome, so that sort of explains why we're starting here. Two, Western civilization is usually defined by the Christian religion, particularly Western Christianity, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And three, the ideas that came out of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment later on in the Middle Ages in Europe. So it's really a synthesis of all three of these traditions that make up Western civilization. So Western civilization then is not necessarily a location. This isn't really the history of Western Europe, but it's really an idea. Western civilization is an idea that is embodied by those three pillars: Christianity, Greek and Roman culture, and philosophy that comes out of Greece and Rome, but also the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. Western civilization traveled as Europeans also traveled. So when the New World was discovered and the United States was formed, the United States is a Western civilization. Australia, New Zealand, even Japan in the 20th century, and South Korea embodied many of the ideals of Western civilization. Okay, so we start with Greece. This ancient civilization was founded on the shores of the Aegean Sea in the Mediterranean, so right kind of in the middle of the map. And archaeologists a lot of times refer to Greek civilization as Aegean civilization, just based on its location. Now there is a lot of history of Greece, so much that you could fill whole books with it. But their civilization dates back to roughly 700, 800 BC, but the most significant events happened during what we call classical Greece. So this is where we find many of the names we're familiar with, such as Socrates, Plato, and Alexander the Great. While the introduction of Christianity, which as we know is one of the main characteristics of Western civilization, wouldn't arrive to the later years of the Roman Empire, it's the Greeks' advancements in early democracy, philosophy, science, and art that solidify them as one of the first great civilizations of Western civilization, and many other advancements that the Greeks made are still used to this day. So it's because of this why we start with Greece, and it's why Greeks are considered the founders of Western civilization. So, but keep in mind that Western civilization and the Greek culture did not develop in a vacuum. So what I mean by that is they were developing while other civilizations were already up and running. The Egyptians had had civilization for 1,000 years already. The Persians had a great empire to the east of them. So they were developing their culture while these cultures were already developing. So many scholars insist that Greek culture was actually pulled heavily on Middle Eastern states and African states as well, and kind of formed this melting pot of a culture that became Greek culture and ultimately Western culture. So a key thing to remember about Greece is that it was not a large, unified empire like Rome would be later on, but it was a collection of individual city-states who were occasionally allied to fight common enemies, but more times than not, these individual city-states fought with each other. So a lot of the major city-states, and there were literally hundreds of them, but the ones that you probably know and have heard of are places like Athens, in Sparta, and maybe Marathon. And then, Athens is the biggest and most influential of all these. But at the same time, a lot of us know about Sparta, which was that mysterious military warrior state. And there's some really interesting things out there about Sparta as well. Here's a little picture of the Greek world. Okay, so like most histories of great civilizations, many key events in Greek history include a lot of wars. So for whatever reason, most civilizations in the histories they're always at war with each other. So no different here. Two main wars define a lot of early Greek history: the Persian War and the Peloponnesian War. And we'll talk just a little bit about those two wars. So the Persian War, you can read volumes and volumes of books about this roughly 50-year war, but in a nutshell, you have the Persian Empire trying to expand their large empire into Greece, and the Greeks more or less successfully fighting back. One of the most famous battles of this war is the infamous Battle of Thermopylae, which featured the Spartan king Leonidas I and his personal bodyguard of 300 men. So if you've seen the movie 300, this is where they get the name for that film. The movie basically depicts just one part of the battle where supposedly Sparta and these 300 men held off a huge Persian army. Most historians agree that the army Sparta had was probably closer to 2,000, but 300 sounds a little better than 2,000. Sounds a little more dramatic. So this war of Greece versus Persia would really be the last time the Greeks fought together, as future wars would pit the Greek city-states against each other. Now, the Persian War has some key significances, and that is really, this is one of the first historical written records from the hand of a man named Herodotus. Herodotus is sometimes called the father of history, as before Herodotus, a lot of history was written in story fashion or drama fashion, much like Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, where Herodotus was the first true historian who really did research and did a real systematic retelling of history. So because of that, Herodotus and his history of the Persian War is very significant in the study of history. Okay, so next we have the Peloponnesian War. This is the other major war in Greek history. This war was fought amongst the Greek city-states themselves. It mainly pitted Athens and her allies against Sparta and their allies. And Sparta and their allies was actually called the Peloponnesian League. By this time, Athens had really grown in size and influence and was really trying to take over all of Greece, and their main competitor was the Spartans and their allies. So this 30-year war basically consisted of both sides killing each other and thus greatly reducing the strength and numbers of the Greeks, and basically ends in a stalemate. Now, this war, because it was fought against each other, really paved the way for Macedonia and later Alexander the Great to come in and dominate Greece due to their weakened state from fighting amongst each other in the Peloponnesian War. Obviously, one of the most critical pieces of Greek history is Greek philosophy. And obviously, we'll just spend a minute here talking about Greek philosophy, which is a massive subject. But Greek philosophy becomes a cornerstone of Western thought, beginning in ancient Greece and continuing all the way through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and all the way into modern times. And it's this tradition of both rationalism and humanism that the Greek philosophers developed. So really, what this means is for the first time, the Greeks focused on the greatness of man, not necessarily the gods. Now, the Greeks had gods that they worshiped, but before now, only gods could achieve greatness. But Greek philosophers theorized that man is capable of great things as well. So the three most influential Greek philosophers were obviously Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and basically in that order. Most of what we know about Socrates, we actually get from his student Plato, who wrote a series of what's called Plato dialogues that basically retold the teaching of Socrates with Socrates as the main character. So we actually have little of Socrates' actual writings, but what we know about Socrates comes from his student Plato. Socrates, as we do know, though, was sentenced to death on the charge of corrupting the youth. So take that, Ozzy Osbourne. So years later, his student Plato had a student named Aristotle, and Aristotle became a leading Greek philosopher as well. And Aristotle actually tutored a young Alexander who would become Alexander the Great. So, the end of the classical age of Greek civilization is marked by the death of Alexander the Great, which ushers in the last age of Greece known as Hellenistic Greece. So we won't go into a lot of the history of Alexander and his conquest. There's a lot of information out there on that, and I think a pretty good film on that you can watch. But really, after Alexander takes over most of the world, he develops this melting pot culture where he combines Greek civilization with the civilization of those that he had taken over. And this is called Hellenistic Greece, so kind of like quasi-Greek culture. So really, he could be considered one of the first advocates for multiculturalism and diversity, because he advocated coming in to territories he took over and combining their cultures to make one. So while the classical period was considered a Renaissance and Enlightenment, the Hellenistic period after Alexander was considered somewhat decadent and less advanced. The Greeks sort of rested on their laurels at this point, saying, hey, we've accomplished a lot, now we're on top. But they wouldn't be on top for long, because another civilization was starting to grow in Italy, and that, of course, is the Romans.